Welcome to Israel Explained, where we help you understand Israel, Israel's neighbors, and provide you with context to understand the Middle East. My name's Avery Chenault, and I'm joined by Passage's resident scholar, Josiah McGee. In 2020, Israel signed a series of new peace agreements with several of its neighbors. At the time, these peace agreements came at somewhat of a surprise. Now, many people around the world are eager for the Abraham Accords to expand to include other Middle Eastern countries. Today, we're unpacking what the Abraham Accords are and how they impact Israel. So, Josiah, whenever the Abraham Accords first started happening, when the significant development happened in the Middle East, it was quite a big deal. So, can you tell us what are the Abraham Accords?
Yeah, no, it really was a big deal. It was a series of peace agreements that was signed in 2020. Thank goodness there was something to celebrate about
I
2020
know.
because it was a terrible year. But
Yes.
towards the end of 2020, there was finally something to celebrate with the Abraham Accords between Israel and several nearby countries. It started really in September of that year with the United Arab Emirates, the UAE,
Mhm.
and Bahrain, and then Morocco and Sudan followed a few months later. And really, at the core, each of the agreements make up this collective accord is a mutual recognition treaty, essentially,
Mhm.
that establishes a formal diplomatic relationship and a commitment to peace between Israel and all of these different countries. There are some additional commitments between Israel and each of the respective countries. They have their own agreement, which spells out things that they want to cooperate on as well, and a few various commitments here and there from the U.S. to sort of help sweeten the deal.
Mhm.
But really, again, at the core, it's basically a commitment to recognizing each other's right to exist
Yeah.
and establishing a formal peace between these countries.
So, for many years leading up to 2020, with the development of the Abraham Accords, there was a pretty significant lack of progress in negotiating peace deals with Israel and other Middle Eastern countries.
Yeah.
So, before the Abraham Accords, why was it so difficult to get these negotiations?
So I think something that has to be maybe addressed first is the geography of the Middle East. The countries which signed the Abraham Accords with Israel are not Israel's immediate neighbors.
Mhm.
So we do have a video on Israel's neighborhood if you want to watch that. Our viewers can watch that.
Yeah.
It explains a little bit about sort of Israel's immediate neighborhood and sort of what it is in closest proximity to which countries. But these countries are a little bit further away. They're in the Arabian Peninsula, they're on
Mhm.
the Gulf, and they're not countries that had been historically, for the most part, in direct conflict with Israel
Mhm.
or on Israel's borders fighting them. So that is an important, I think, historical note. There was, however, a history of diplomatic conflict between most of these countries and Israel.
Mhm.
So after the 1967 war, the Arab League, the collection of Arab countries, not just those that were fighting Israel during the Six-Day War, but also most of the rest of the Middle East, gathered and they passed a resolution in Khartoum, Sudan, which basically included the three no's, as they were later referred to, became
Mhm.
pretty famous: no peace, no recognition, no negotiation. So there was a commitment from all these Arab countries, even those that hadn't been fighting Israel,
Mhm.
that there would be no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel's right to exist,
Yeah.
and no negotiating with Israel. So that did sort of create a major roadblock for many decades for Israel to make peace with any of these countries, even though it didn't have a long history of military conflict with them like it did countries like Egypt and Syria
Yeah.
or Jordan, Lebanon. It still had this roadblock in place, and it Israel did make peace with other countries like Egypt,
Mhm.
like Jordan, and even other groups like the PLO, for example. But I think what's interesting about that is that those peace agreements typically were done with countries that did have a history of violent conflict with Israel.
Mhm.
They typically followed a significant or serious period of conflict with Israel, and they were made more than likely because of that violent conflict,
Yeah.
in order to end that conflict. So, ironically, the fact that Israel did not have wars being fought directly with some of these other countries made it harder because there was less incentive, less urgency to make a
Mhm.
peace deal if there's no violent conflict between you.
Interesting. That's very interesting. I've never considered the fact that if there was no contact through this violent conflict, it would be difficult to start these peace negotiations. That's very interesting to think about.
Yeah.
So you talked about how before the Abraham Accords, there was very much many of these countries were very against negotiating peace with Israel or even
Yeah.
acknowledging Israel's right to exist. So, how did we go from many of these countries not even acknowledging Israel to then wanting to negotiate with them? And how did this happen?
So a bit of realpolitik, I think, is what is at play. You have a situation in which most of these countries, the reason why they don't want to recognize Israel's right to exist
Yeah.
is because the Palestinian issue remained a very important symbolic issue for most
Mhm.
of the Arab world, and still is today, even post Abraham Accords.
Yeah.
It was a serious roadblock to peace because it would be hard to sell to the public of any pick a random Arab country that peace would be made with Israel, especially if there was no clear incentive to do so.
Mhm.
And what changed really is that the incentive structure changed
Mhm.
essentially. All of a sudden, there were reasons why the political obstacles to making peace with Israel could be overlooked. They didn't go away, but they could be overlooked because there were some serious incentives to making peace with Israel.
Yeah.
So there's a few different things that are going on. A lot of it had to do with a combination of opportunity and threats. So you had, of course, some pretty significant things happening during the first Trump administration in terms of
Mhm.
regional dynamics. And a lot of what was happening was this growing sense that Iran was becoming stronger. But the United States and the Middle East wanted to reverse that trend.
Yeah.
They were concerned that the nuclear deal made by the Obama administration was too relaxed, that the Iranians might use it to eventually break out to a nuclear weapon, that they were using a lot of the funds that they were getting as part of sanctions relief under that deal
Mhm.
to basically prop up and organize different proxy military networks around the region and exert more and more influence. And for both the US and a lot of these Arab countries and Israel, there was this shared sense of the danger that represented. They did not want Iran growing too strong or exerting too much influence around the region, and there also was a strong sense that they needed to be able to compete with Iran in order to counter that influence in the region. There also was, I think, a sense of there being some opportunity, not just threat, but also opportunity,
Mhm.
because what people realized was that Israel was very powerful. It represented a set of resources and skills that would be necessary to compete with Iran, both in terms of its economic clout and its military prowess as well. It is an amazing place with incredible technology and incredible eh, resourcefulness,
Mhm.
incredible military strength. And a lot of these countries realized if we want to develop economically, then it's a good idea to invest in the high tech sector in Israel.
Yeah.
It's a good idea to invest in some of the other technology that they're producing when it comes to things like energy, natural gas, water, all of these important resources.
Yeah.
It's a good idea to try to collaborate with them on how to counter Iran from a security standpoint,
Mhm.
whether that's building into some sort of integration of our air defense systems or intelligence sharing, things like that. It's just a good idea to try to work together. And so that opportunity really started to stand out to these countries and became part of the changing incentive structure to sort of look past the Palestinian problem. Now, what's interesting is that even before the Abraham Accords, a lot of these countries were secretly looking for ways to collaborate with Israel. They were already kind of doing it under the table
Yeah.
and just wink, wink, nod,
Mhm.
nobody has to know about it kind of thing. But it was after, I think, or it was during the Abraham Accords, I should say, that it became public for the first
Mhm.
time. And that is a really interesting phenomenon. It kind of raises the question, like, why now, if you will? What made the difference between a few months ago and then when the accords were signed? What changed? Why was it important to go from cooperating in secret to openly working together in the public? And it's hard to ascertain exactly what happened, when countries decided that the benefits were greater than the political risks. I think for the UAE, there was some reporting going on at the time that was interesting, that it has something to do with this Palestinian problem as well,
Mhm.
actually. The Palestinian issue wasn't just the obstacle, it also was part of the incentive structure for the UAE to make peace with Israel, that the UAE received a commitment from Israel that it would not formally annex large parts of the West Bank
Yeah.
in exchange for peace with the UAE, at least not in the short term.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. The Palestinian issue was kind of the problem and the incentive for the Abraham Accords at the end of the day.
Yeah. That's very interesting. So, with the development of the Abraham Accords, it was a huge win for the region. It was a huge win for Israel and so many other Middle Eastern countries. But can you share with us some of the specific reasons that each country chose to make peace with Israel? So, obviously, it was a great deal for Israel, but what was in it for other countries?
Yeah. So, well, we've just mentioned what the UAE wanted in exchange. This freeze in the West Bank. There also was a lot of requests for help with different forms of technology, and interest in trade,
Mhm.
in technology exchanges, and information sharing, all kinds of things. So the UAE was really, I think, one of the more comprehensive agreements. There was a long list of things that they wanted out of the agreement. Morocco wanted something like U.S. recognition of sovereignty over a contested territory
Mhm.
called the Western Sahara. There's a separatist region, if you will, and that Morocco wanted recognition of as part of its sovereign territory in exchange for participation in the Abraham Accords. So there was
Mhm.
some quid pro quo working pretty strongly to make sure that these deals got across the finish line in that respect. But at the end of the day, each country had pretty broad things that they ask for, and a couple of little things, if you will,
Mhm.
not little, but a couple of, let's say, specific things that they wanted in exchange for
Mhm.
their inclusion in the Abraham Accords.
Mhm. Yeah, so we talked a lot about how the Abraham Accords are just so significant to the region, and but we haven't really talked much about what the specifics that the Abraham Accords say are.
Hmm.
So I'm sure we can't get into every single detail of the Abraham Accords in this video, at least. But can you kind of give us an overview of what the Abraham Accords say?
Yeah. So it's a good question. I think it is important to note that the Abraham Accords is not one treaty that everyone signed on to.
Mm-hmm.
Five countries signed on to, whatever.
Yeah.
It's a collection of treaties
Mm-hmm.
that Israel signed with each of the individual countries. There was also a general principles document that sort of outlines the thought process behind all of the treaties, because they were signed roughly at the same time. But there's specific documents that outline the relationship between Israel and each of the countries.
Yeah.
The general principles of really all of them, there's some similarities between all of them, and they are as follows. They're built on a recognition of pluralism and religious freedom.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this strong sense that they're trying to bake into these peace treaties this principle of tolerance for Judaism and Islam, and the people that
Yeah.
observe both religions in the Middle East, as well as Christianity is also recognized
Mm-hmm.
there. It's committed to mutual recognition and flourishing. So the idea being that it's really pretty groundbreaking that all these countries are finally recognizing Israel has a right to exist,
Mm-hmm.
but not just to exist, but that they have a right to flourish,
Yeah.
and they can help the Arab countries flourish as well. It I should say, when I say it, the Abraham Accords, each of the agreements in turn, in their own way, in some form or fashion, sort of rejects radicalization and conflict. It tries to sort of cast this vision for a more peaceful future
Mm-hmm.
that is not as radicalized or
Yeah.
as violent. It includes a commitment to collaboration and dialogue. They prioritize cooperation in a wide variety of fields, everything from science, medicine, technology, commerce, telecommunications, aviation, outer space, finance, tourism and culture, education, water, the environment, maritime trade, even art.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a wide variety of ways that they see room for cooperation developing. And so they really try to spell out all the different ways that peace could benefit both sides of these different treaties, all the different ways they could work together, built around this idea that they should not only coexist, but they should actively help each other
Yeah.
in order to make a better future. And I would say that the UAE treaty probably is the most thorough and specific of them all, probably has been the most successful.
Mhm.
Maybe we can get more into that a little bit in terms of the success of these agreements, but most of the others were slightly more ambiguous, a lot of
Mhm.
very lofty language, but sort of agree to work out the details later type language, if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
That is really, really interesting to think about the fact that it was like one significant development in the region, but very specialized in a way to each country's relationship with Israel. So that's really, really interesting. So, we know that these Abraham Accords were very historical, but can you give us some more information on why the Abraham Accords are so significant and continue to be so significant today?
Well, there's a few reasons. One, they were not the traditional land for peace agreements that Israel typically made. So previously, it would make agreements with Egypt, for example, give the Sinai Peninsula back in exchange for peace.
Hmm.
Or with the Palestinians, the Oslo Accords would give Palestinians control of some territory in exchange for peace, in theory. Or with Hamas in Gaza, Israel pulls out of Gaza and hopes that there will be peace with Hamas after Israel leaves Gaza in 2005. So there's a long history of Israel making these kinds of peace agreements.
Hmm.
This was a unique set of agreements because Israel did not give up territory in exchange for them. Again, it was not a they weren't strictly speaking a cessation of hostilities or an end of war treaty. It was a peace treaty on the grounds that it was something positive to be gained. It wasn't it wasn't a necessary evil to make peace with Israel. It was a voluntary choice to make peace with Israel
Yeah.
because there was something positive to be gained.
Hmm.
So it really recommended, or not recommended, it marked a very significant shift in terms of the region's view of Israel
Hmm.
and the possibilities of what a relationship with Israel could look like, whether it was possible and what it could achieve.
Hmm.
And it also, I think, represents a commitment to collaborating for mutual benefit in a wide variety of ways, as we just touched on a little bit. It also, I think, really just made the case again that Israel has the right to exist. It's very significant, not only that they recognized Israel has a right to exist, but that the agreements spelled out the reason why Israel has a right to exist.
Yeah.
This commitment to pluralism and tolerance and shared origins in the region historically and in the person of Abraham.
Yeah.
It's really pretty remarkable that they would not just accept but elaborate on
For sure.
why they agree Israel has a right to exist.
Yeah. So we've already established that the Abraham Accords were very significant. But looking back, in your opinion, do you think that they were successful?
It's a mixed bag depending on the country. I would say Sudan, at the time we're recording at least, since the Abraham Accords, it's been a rough go for Sudan, a lot of internal conflict. So not a lot of progress has been made on that front in terms of implementing the agreement there. In terms of public acceptance among the other states, it's challenging to say.
Mm.
It in places like Bahrain and Morocco, there can be some anti-Israel protests.
Mm.
In the UAE, maybe a little bit less, but still some of that. So it's hard to say whether it's just the governments that have sort of signed on to this, or whether
Mm.
the people also support this concept of peace with Israel. I will say the UAE was an early adopter of the idea that public education would be required in order
Mm.
to make these deals a success. So they very early on sort of studied the public curriculum in the UAE and determined that they would need to make some revisions in order to educate the public on
Mm.
why these deals are a good thing,
Yeah.
why Israel's not evil, and why Israel has the right to exist,
Hmm.
and why anti-Semitism is bad, and that kind of thing. So that was a very encouraging sign
Yeah.
that even if the public is not quite there yet, that there is a recognition of the importance that education plays
Mm-hmm.
in preparing people for and helping people take steps towards actual peace.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Where the deals have been implemented, again, Sudan's kind of their own exception, but where the deals have been implemented, there's also been, I think, some tremendous economic gains. The most successful case, again, would be the UAE. Really, I think they've just been the most committed
Yeah.
to fully implementing and engaging this peace process with Israel. And they have really seen some pretty significant gains. Morocco and Bahrain have also seen some pretty significant increase in trade
Mm-hmm.
and cooperation. I think that the big thing that stands out to me is that the deals survived the October 7 war.
Mm-hmm.
That was not a given. You know, some Palestinian officials believe, and I think this probably is true if you listen to what Hamas says, that one of the reasons why Hamas attacked on October 7 was an effort to sabotage the Abraham Accords and especially to prevent them from expanding
Mm-hmm.
to any new countries.
Yeah.
And that makes a lot of sense. You know, during the course of the war, Bahrain did at one point recall its ambassador because of the war in Gaza. It has maintained an official diplomatic relationship with Israel, thankfully, but you know, it has been a little bit turbulent
Yeah.
through the course of the war. The UAE has strongly supported Israel despite protesting various parts of the war and has criticized Hamas for the role that it's played. The UAE even helped to defend Israel against an attack from Iran.
Yeah.
This is really pretty remarkable, I think. You know, an early example of just how powerful and significant implementation of the Abraham Accords is. When Iran, in I think it was April of 2024,
Mm-hmm.
decided to attack Israel with something like 300 projectiles, drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles. And there was this coalition around the Middle East that had to come together in order to stop these projectiles from hitting Israel. And it wasn't just Israel or even the United States
Mm-hmm.
or some European allies that came together in order to stop this attack and prevent them from hitting Israel. It was some of these Arab countries.
Yeah.
Places like Jordan
Yeah.
was involved. The UAE was involved. Bahrain probably was involved.
Yeah.
So you have examples like this where the war has certainly tested the relationship, but the fact that it has not only survived, but has seen cases where these countries actually come to Israel's defense,
Mm-hmm.
that would have been unfathomable
Yeah.
before something like the Abraham Accords.
Yeah.
Can you even imagine
Exactly.
an Arab country coming to Israel's defense
Mm-hmm.
against another regional power? It would have been hard to imagine.
Yeah.
So I think in that respect, yes, there have been some setbacks. October 7 has changed the Middle East forever,
Mm-hmm.
but ultimately I think the deals have succeeded and there's a lot more potential that they can and hopefully will reach in the future.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think what you're talking about, the Iran attack in April of 2024, just how significant it was to have, like, you literally seeing the defense and seeing the Abraham Accords play out in such a critical moment was really significant to see. And I think whenever I think about the Abraham Accords, one of my favorite things about the Abraham Accords is the innovation that has
Mhm.
come from the Abraham Accords and the
Yeah.
cultural exchange. And you think about just the significant technological developments, and even when it comes to environmental science and engineering and so many things, the Abraham Accords has really influenced that in the Middle East. And I just think that is so cool how that has happened with countries that didn't want anything to do with Israel in the beginning. And now they're collaborating on such significant technologies and things like that. So I think it's very interesting.
It's amazing, I think. One more anecdote I think is really, really interesting. It's a small thing, but in my mind, it's meaningful.
Yeah.
The first Emirati student to study at an Israeli university following the Abraham Accords, that was a big deal too.
Oh, yeah.
The idea that you could travel back and forth between
Mhm.
the UAE and Israel. I mean, people do that all the time now. It's
Yeah.
direct flights, which is, again, unfathomable a few years ago. But you can travel back and forth. You have Israelis living in Dubai or Abu Dhabi. You have, in some cases, Emiratis spending time in Israel. And the first student who came to study at an Israeli university came to study nursing,
Yeah.
which might seem like a small thing, but that's a big deal.
Yeah.
That someone would choose to come live in Israel and enroll full time in university in Israel and study to become a nurse. I mean, imagine the benefits to humanity if
Exactly.
this were more common and
Yeah.
less rare and less remarkable,
Mhm.
that you could visit a neighboring country
Yeah.
and study to become a nurse and then use that to serve other people. I mean, you can just imagine
Yeah.
if there was more of this, how much benefit to humanity
Mhm.
that you might see in the Middle East.
I completely agree. That's an amazing story. So we've talked so much about how the Abraham Accords has been such a significant development for the region. So, in your opinion, what do you think it would take for the Abraham Accords to expand to include other countries in the Middle East?
Yeah, that's a interesting question right now. Again, it's hard. Post October 7, I think people are still trying to wrap their heads around how soon is it possible for the next step to happen and what would the next step be. There seems to be two big dominoes people are kind of waiting to fall. The first one is Saudi Arabia. It would represent just a symbolic earthquake in the region in a lot of
Mhm.
ways. It's one thing for the UAE to say, we're going to sign this deal on the basis of pluralism and freedom of religion and shared roots in the person of Abraham. And we're going to build this faith house for all three Abrahamic religions. And it's going to be beautiful and amazing. It would be another thing entirely for Saudi Arabia,
Mhm.
the kingdom which is the custodians of the holy sites
Yeah.
of Islam, the two holy sites in
Mhm.
Mecca and Medina, to also extend that same recognition of Israel and the Jewish state's right
Yeah.
to exist in the Middle East. That would be
Mhm.
just massive in
Yeah.
terms of what that would mean for the region and how many other countries might follow suit if the Saudi monarchy took that step. It would probably give others a lot of quote unquote permission to do the same.
Mhm.
If not officially, it would symbolically it would communicate
Yeah.
that there would be permission to make peace with Israel. It would also represent another pretty major strategic player in the region who is a on again, off again foe of Iran.
Mhm.
You know, historically, it's been mostly in competition with Iran.
Yeah.
Recently, it has sort of normalized relations and started some diplomatic talks with Iran, but most people think that in the long run, it is going to continue to be a strategic competitor of Iran's.
Mhm.
So it would add another layer to that, counter Iran network in the Middle East that the U.S. and Israel have been trying to build. And in terms of what it would take, it's tough to say. The crown prince seems to be somewhat on board already.
Mhm.
The challenge is that he's restrained by his somewhat elderly father, the king, who's
Yeah.
not on board at this time. That doesn't seem to be. And there's various political alliances in Saudi Arabia that he has to navigate.
Mhm.
He is definitely a modernizing crown prince, but there are anti-modern forces in Saudi Arabia that are working against things like
Mhm.
peace with Israel. So it's unclear exactly what it would take for him to take that next step, but certainly respect for his father is one of
Yeah.
the challenges, the obstacles. You also have another country like Indonesia would be
Mhm.
the second big domino. If that were to fall, it would make a huge difference because it's so large. You have something like 200 million Muslims
Yeah.
living in Indonesia. That would be huge. It would also represent an extension of the Abraham Accords outside the Middle East and into the broader Muslim world,
Mhm.
which would be symbolically also very significant and
Yeah.
important. But it's unclear what exactly it would take. I would say the Palestinian issue is obviously a roadblock for Saudi Arabia, possibly for Indonesia. And in terms of what it would require to remove that roadblock, there seems to be some back and forth. If you're just sort of listening to what's happening in the media, you're going to hear conflicting statements like we're close, or we're not very close,
Yeah.
or we need a two-state solution, or we just need an end to the war in Gaza.
Mhm.
And it's hard to say. Not being in the room,
Yeah.
I don't know what the
Yeah.
truth is, to be
Absolutely.
honest, in terms of what's that red line that
Yeah.
the Saudi crown prince needs Israel to reach
Mhm.
or meet him at
Yeah.
before he can make peace with them. I'm not sure. But regardless, I would say it seems to be a worthy and very significant foreign policy priority of the U.S. right now on both sides of the political aisle. And hopefully, the further we get away from October 7, the easier it will be for these peace agreements to expand and grow in the region.
Yes, hopefully so. Maybe one day in the future we'll be making a video about the expansion of the Abraham Accords. We'll just have to see what happens.
Would love to do that.
I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for sharing all this information about the Abraham Accords with us. Be sure to check out the description below for more videos in this Israel Explained series that might be helpful to help you further explain and understand some of the topics we discussed today. If you have any questions, please leave us a comment down below and we would be happy to answer your question. If you're looking for more resources related to Israel and the Middle East, be sure to check us out on social media. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.